How do you take a photo like this, and why would you want to? I'll tell you more in just a moment. Let's talk motion blur. Typically, this is a slow shutter speed and moving the camera. Now, if I hark back to, I think this was 2 years ago, yes, there's no halo, so that's 2 years ago, in China, I take this shot of this is Ocon, heading down the straight on one of the practice days in China. So there are very few people in the grandstand. But luckily, those grandstand seats are all different colors. By moving the camera at exactly the same speed as the car is going, I get this beautiful motion blur of everything but the car, which stays sharp. Now, I'll tell you what I'm shooting that at. Over here, it says I'm shooting at 1/15th of a second. Now, that's no mean feat to keep that sharp at 1/15th of a second. And I got to tell you, at that speed, I don't get too many sharp. Those guys have been doing it for decades. They'll have a far better hit rate than I will. Here's a shot that I've taken in the pit lane at that same race. And the thing I'm looking for here is sharpness. That doesn't have to be the whole car. And in fact, because I'm using a reasonably wide-ish lens, I'm never going to get the whole car sharp. But I'm looking at the helmet. How is it? Let's have a look. It's pretty good. Good enough for me anyway. Now, if you have a look at this picture coming out of the tunnel in Monaco this year, Lewis Hamilton, see the tyres? You can see that there is no blur on those. So I've taken this at a very high shutter speed. That's something like a 4,000th of a second. And the reason I've done that is because I'm down low behind the Armco and I can't physically pan that lens, otherwise I'm going to hit the fence. So I've had to wear the fact that for this shot, there is no motion blur. There is no real indication that that car is moving. Quite frankly, it could have been parked there and I could have got the same photo at, say, a 1/10 of a second. If I now hark forward to Melbourne, this shot here, nice wide shot, but look, there's a lot of crap around it. You've got fencing here, you've got people, cars. The clouds look nice, but if I suddenly, and that's probably taken at 1,000th of a second, if I now go to a much slower shutter speed, and in this instance I'm at a 1/13th of a second, which is very slow, yes, the car is not super sharp. How sharp is the helmet? Let's have a look. Yeah, once again, it's small in the shot, so that's acceptable. But now your attention is focused solely on that pink car. You don't see those people down below. You don't see the crap and the wire. Your attention is focused there. Now this is at a slightly longer shutter speed. And if I go back and tell you that is at a 25th, so not a great difference. Nearly, it's open for a 1/10 of a second less. Moving forward now to Mexico in the stadium. Sebastian Vettel from 2 years ago. As you can see, everything in the background is reasonably sharp. It's discernible. If I then go and change that to a much slower shutter speed, I blur the background, I blur the fence and all that signage, and your attention is focused on the car to a lot greater extent. Another shot at the same spot. Once again, if you blur by doing a slower shutter speeding and panning with the car, you tend to take away that distraction of what's happening in the background. Using this technique in the pits is a great opportunity here. The car's sharp, but you can see that they're moving because their feet are blurred. In this case here, I'm panning with Pierre Gasly's car, and the mechanics are all blurred because they're moving, and also the person in the foreground is blurred. Now, with this one here, I've kept the camera stationary, locked off, and I've let the car's movement blur the shot because I'm shooting at probably a 15th or a 10th of a second there. In here, I've shot at what speed? Let me tell you. A 50th, the car's moving out of the garage. The helmet's sharp, front and back. You can see obviously effects of motion, but once again, because I'm using a wide angle lens, I'm never going to get the whole car sharp. And I'll show you some other examples where I've used a 600 where the whole car is sharp. Coming out of the garage again, this is in Abu Dhabi, and that great motion blur in the background. Melbourne, this year, turn 6. There's a great shot here where I can get rid of much of what that Pirelli signage is in the background, so it's not distracting to you. The wire has a much nicer look, and I shot a few cars here at this slow shutter speed. And once again, all I look for here for sharpness is the helmet. Yeah, that's okay. Look, it's a matter of art, really. It's how sharp do you want this to be, and I'll get to some other shots here in a minute. Here I'm standing on a platform in Melbourne around the back of the track, and I've got people in the foreground. Now I do like putting people, in fact it can be anything in the foreground, I'll discuss some tree shots in a second, but because you get people in the foreground, they tend to be blurred. The fence, because I'm panning in the same line as the wire on the fence, that looks to be just straight lines. Here's a couple of different examples, and as the car gets closer to disappearing, you get a little bit of overlapping up the top here. Where we go? There we go here. As you can still see a bit of the wheel, but you've also got people in front. And once again, I've done that by just simply tracking with the car using a long lens, so from front to back is sharp. I love this shot in Mexico. I'm actually standing on one of the wooden tables where people eat and drink at, and I'm standing right high, so I'm probably 1.5 meters above where I'd normally shoot from. So I get people in the foreground, I get the car in the background. Now if I go back to this particular shot at a 30th of a second, both of them are at a 30th of a second. It's a lovely colour thing at the front, you've got the car that's sharp, and then you've got a bit more blurred colour at the top, which I tend to like. And it also means that the signage in the background is not really discernible. Now yes, you can make out that that one there is DHL, but certainly when we're photographing, we don't like having overt signage, unless of course you're shooting for DHL, in which case they wouldn't find this picture at all of interest to them. Putting trees in the foreground is a great way of making a photo a little more interesting. I shot in this spot purely because it's nice and close to the pits and the paddock, so I could just nip down there, say during quali, and do 1 and 2 sessions of quali down there, and then get back pretty quickly to the pits. So you get that car looking sharp, but there's blur in front of it, there's trees in front of it to give that a nice feel. Now when you're shooting the start, you don't want to be shooting at a low shutter speed. You want to be shooting at 1,000th or more, because if something exciting happens, you want to catch it sharp. So once again, here's the example here of a nice sharp shot. You don't want anything slow shutter speed here. Now this particular shot is the last corner entering on the straight in Melbourne. I've shot that at an 800th of a second. But look what happens if I change to a much slower shutter speed and I zoom at the same time. I make the center of the picture my focus, and as the car comes towards me, and I'm on a 70 to 200 lens here, with my left hand, I zoom the focus ring in. It is a very tricky shot, and I rarely get anything super sharp, but in terms of a nice picture, that's got a lot of colour in it. And it's interesting, it's something you don't normally see, and you know that that car is moving. And you can tell I've zoomed in because of the lines here, the way that's moving there, and also you've got tyres here, you've got tyre mark here, and I think that's just an interesting looking picture. As is this one, I've zoomed in a little bit here in Hungary. Is this Hungary? Yeah, it's around the back of the track at the chicane. Now this shot is from the tower in Melbourne. At normal speed I'd take a start shot with say 1,000th of a second. But look what happened when I go into, in this case, 1/4 of a second. Now that is an extraordinarily long time to have the shutter open. And really you're not going to get anything sharp at 1/4 of the second with a car moving at 150 kilometres an hour, unless you jag it or unless you're the best guy in the world. So in this instance here, what I've done is, because to keep the shutter open for 1/4 of the second in bright sunshine is impossible because it lets too much light in. I've had to use an ND filter. This is an ND8, I think. Effectively, what I'm doing is putting this piece of darkened glass in front of the lens so that I can keep the shutter open for longer. It's a bit like putting sunglasses on your camera lens. So I've done that, I've put that in, it allows me to shoot at that slower shutter speed, and I follow the car down with the camera, and as it gets to a certain point I jerk it left or right, so I get these rather remarkable lines in it. And I was only introduced to that a couple of years ago, and I admit I don't try it that often, but when I do, occasionally I get something that looks a little bit interesting here. And you can make out it's Sebastian Vettel, you can see the 5 on the front of the car, and you get that lovely green and gold of the curbing. So if I head back here, this over here, this green and gold here, is what suddenly turns into that. Here's a shot at Hungary at a 640th of a second. I've taken this one here at a much slower shutter speed. This one's at an 80th of a second. And see the difference in quality. Suddenly the background is blurred to a greater degree and your attention is more focused on Kevin Magnussen. Here's another example of that zoom in while I'm panning. Once again, you're never going to get anything super sharp at that speed. You're more looking for some sort of art to give it a creative look. A couple of other examples here. Sebastian Vettel at that same section of track at 125th of a second. This one here, 125th. This one's slightly faster at 160th. Not a great deal of difference. There's a bit more blur in the background, but it really, unless I told you that, you probably wouldn't have known. This is Parabolica, where we get to stand up on this platform right above the track and shoot the cars below. Now if I use a fast shutter speed of an 800th here, everything looks sharp. Grass, curbing, car, even the other side of the track is sharp in focus. And same again here, a little bit more blurred because I've dropped that down now to a 400th and the car is moving at a fair clip, I can tell you. But if I go and drop it down to there, and I'll tell you what I'm at, a 20th, you can make out that that's a car, that's a Toro Rosso of Pierre Gasly, because see these yellow lines up here, that's the markings on top of the camera. That's the second car of the Red Bull Toro Rosso team. So that's Gasly. It's a nice looking colourful shot. If I go to the other side where they're coming towards me, here's Lando again at a 250th of a second. This is slightly slower. What are we at here? I'll tell you what, I'll do that. That's a bit easier. That's a 100th of a second. This is an 80th of a second. See how it differs? 100th there, 80th, a little bit more blurring in the background, and a 13th. Well, everything's blurred, even the cars. But there you go. That's another piece of art that you'll decide whether you like. And if I hark back to Monza on turn 3, the exit of turn 3, I've gone down low here. I've shot at a 40th of a second. Yeah, and here's another Red Bull at a 40th of a second. Nice blur in the background. Car's sharp. I like the look of it. Dramatically different shot when you go down to a 1/6 of a second. See how the 8 here on the Romain Grosjean car has two different sizes. That's because I'm zooming in at a 1/6 of a second, and this shot here of Charles Leclerc exiting turn 3 is shot at, once again, a 1/6 of a second, and I'm zooming in at the same time. Now you don't have to limit this to just cars. You can do slow shutter speed shots and pan with the subject on people, as I have done here with Alex Albon. His face is sharp, but everything around it is blurry. Here's a second shot of the young man too. Example here in Silverstone where the car is sharp but the photographers on the right aren't, because I'm panning with the car. If I focus on the photographers and just let the car come through shot, you can see it's coming through at speed because it is blurred. And if we go to Hockenheim, last corner, uninteresting shot, suddenly change it to a slow shutter speed and pan with the car, and it's a little bit more interesting. You can do it with wide angle too, up the top of the stands here. Here we go in Austria, where you've got the background that's a little out of focus, but there's no movement involved until I change the shutter speed and go to something slower, and then the background is not indiscernible, but less discernible from the car. Last corner at Germany, bit of rain, I get that lovely reflection shot down below, and I wanted to blur out the background at the top, so I shoot here at 1/60th of a second. Car's going fast enough. Second example here with Max Verstappen at the same speed. And if we jump back to Austria now, you get the sea of orange from quite a long way. I'm probably 250 metres from the Racing Point car of Sergio Perez as it goes through that area. Now we jump to Silverstone with Charles Leclerc. I've shot at a slow shutter speed to blur all that crap out in the background, and thankfully there is no signage on that white barrier there, top and bottom, and it's a nice clean image. Now what happens is when you have two cars going at slightly different speeds, you will get one sharp, as in the case of Alex Albon in the front, but Max Verstappen is travelling faster. In this instance he's attempting to overtake, so he's a little bit more blurred. Here's another example of Charles sharp, because I've panned with him, and the car behind Verstappen, he's not quite as sharp because he's not travelling at exactly that same speed. Here's Charles Leclerc once again at Silverstone, and he's coming past the BRDC headquarters. which is sharp, or certainly visible enough, but I didn't want that, so I decided to drop it from an 800th down to 160th of a second, and look what happens. You get that lovely blur, the car is sharp in the foreground, and you can see that there is movement on the car because the tyres have that blurring of the logo, the Pirelli logo around the edge. This shot I shot at about a 50th of a second, Lance Stroll out of control in Budapest. Now, at some point, I've decided to bail out of that, so I have a button on my camera which allows me to change very quickly to 1,000th of a second automatically. It's one press and I can keep shooting. So yes, it is a markedly different shot. You've got all this blur here at a 50th of a second, and you hope you get the helmet sharp. I jagged that one, and then bang, you change up to 1,000th of a second, and you get sharp on the car and perhaps less blurry in the background. Now, I'm not great at this, but I certainly love having a crack at it. Some of the greats at it are people like Glenn Dunbar from LAT Images. Mark Thompson from Getty is also pretty good, as is Florent Gooden. These are guys that have been doing it for many years and have mastered the art, although I think every photographer is still learning. So there you have it, some tips on how to shoot motion blur, if you're keen to have a crack at it. Anyway, like and subscribe so you don't miss out on future videos. And if you've got comments about future videos, I'd like to hear those as well. You can find all of my pics at prostarpics.com. My blogs and podcasts are at kimillman.com. And for pics live from the track every race, go to Instagram at kimillman. Thanks for watching and stay passionate.